Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I know how difficult it can be scheduling, finding, traveling in the sun. So thanks very much for coming. We have an interesting panel, key decision and discussion around multilateral development banks and their size. And the first question I'm going to ask my two panelists, and let me introduce them. I have on my right Ilen Mirovic from IDB Invests and the climate change, a director in the climate change area, and Hans-Peter Lankes, who is currently managing director and deputy CEO of the ODI and has a lot of multilateral development bank experience at EBRD and IFC.
At IMF.
And IMF. Perhaps in this debate, most well known for being one of the members of the CAF review. So often when talking about multilateral development banks, these days we refer to the CAF review as if everyone should know about it. Well, he has a lot to do with those numbers. And is also fantastic at explaining those numbers. So I want to kick off with, it was Archimedes, right, who said that, give me a lever long enough and I can move the world. And the question is, the multilateral development banks, they're that lever, but they're not long enough. So if you listen to the Singh-Summers report, the independent high-level expert group report, which Hans-Peter and I are both members of, they're talking about tripling the amount of lending the multilateral development banks do, tripling. So from around $100 billion a year to $300 billion a year. So the question is that possible? Is that tripling, how could that happen? How much of that tripling can be done without new capital, and how much of that tripling would have to rely on new capital? So Hans-Peter, do you want to kick off on that?
Sure, with pleasure. Yes, I mean, it's a very good question. I think after about 2 years of panels of all sorts at the G20 and for the COPs, we have really come down to the conclusion that the MDBs are the most scalable of the various different sources of finance that we can be looking at right now, or at least the one that's most within our might to change if we have the political will and do it. And in part, that is going to be fairly low cost for the international community because it's fairly clear that the MDBs have over the decades built up considerable risk buffers that are probably well beyond the levels that are required to maintain their ratings and their access to cheap funding. The MDBs have recognized that, and we now see in various of the institutions' efforts to, if you want, reduce these buffers. The way that risk functions, a little bit of change there can have a very large impact on the lending capacity of these institutions. So we see at the World Bank, for instance, the IBRD, the non-concessional public arm of the World Bank, that a 1 percentage point reduction in the equity to loans ratio, which is their main so headline number there, 1% allows them to lend $4 billion more each year. Our estimate, yeah?
You want to unpack that a little bit. So for every loan, say a $100 loan, how much equity are they putting in now, and how much equity will they put in going forward?
For a loan today, on a sustainable annual lending level basis, IBRD puts $1 aside of equity for each $5 of lending. Our estimate is that they could easily go down to 1 for every 6 of lending. And if you take that up, it creates considerable annual lending headroom. Over a 10-year period, what we would estimate they could gain from that is probably on the order of a 40% increase in their lending levels. So that is IBRD. Other institutions, and we may hear from the Inter-American Development Bank, are in different situations, but some are more endowed with equity, like the Asian Development Bank right now, others less, like the African Development Bank. If you average it out across the institutions, we're probably not very far from the estimate that we have in the IEG report, which has been picked up here, that from capital measures alone, there could be about a 40% increase in the ability to lend. And that includes, by the way, just quickly, not just risk and the way that they would use their callable capital, can we get more technical on that, but also a change in their business models to hold less and turn over more of their portfolios.
Okay, so that's getting me about 40% more,
Yeah.
not quite tripling.
No.
What about, is doubling possible? And if doubling is possible, what is the next other instrument or lever we'd have to look at?
So there are other instruments that are useful, and ones that we have highlighted and that are now under consideration in various of the MDBs are hybrid capital. That is, instead of going for shareholder equity, can you go for other sources of quasi-equity with a slightly lower leverage level, but still a considerable bang for your buck? And they're all looking at this. The rating agencies give the MDBs scope for about a quarter, a third maybe of their capital, depends on Moody's or S&P's, that could be raised in hybrid capital within their guidelines. And efforts are underway to do that. Another approach is to use guarantees in a smart way. The Asian Development Bank has gone ahead with a very interesting scheme. That's the IFCAP, the International Financing Facility for Climate Asia Pacific, where they use guarantees for the economic capital at risk, that is for portfolios of projects, and they get a very high leverage ratio out of that. There's a similar one, actually, which the Education Commission has been championing for a decade, which has an even higher ratio. But the idea is the same. You use a certain amount of paid-in capital, if you want, from donors, and then you leverage this up through guarantees to larger portfolios. You put these things together, our estimate, you can get up to another 40% of additional annual lending. And that at a cost of perhaps $4 or $5 billion annually to the MDB system and whoever these donors are.
I think that's really powerful. Let me try and see if I can unpack that a little bit, and you tell me if I've got this right. So, normally if you take an individual loan, you're putting some capital against a loan that's going to absorb the loss if the loan goes wrong. But here, what they're doing is they're saying, I'm going to put all these loans together, and I'm going to guarantee this portfolio of loans, and the amount of capital I have to put up is much lower because I'm only having to absorb my capital if all of these loans together collectively are going down. And I think Gordon Brown was one of the champions of this idea, and their estimates are that you could probably leverage rather than 1 to 6, it could be 1 to 20. $1 of capital could lead to $20 of lending. That may be ambitious, but certainly much higher than the 1 to 6. Have I got that right?
No, they say 27. I think that is ambitious, but it is quite clear that you can be cleverer than the way that guarantees are typically used today. So if you look at several official donors are supporting investments in the Ukraine right now, for instance, the US, UK, European Union, and those are guarantees on the nominal value of individual transactions. That is 100% guarantee for individual transactions. That's a very inefficient way of doing it. What we're talking about is take the whole portfolio of the Inter-American Development Bank in the renewable energy space and guarantee the equity at stake in that portfolio. And you do that, especially if you then spread it internationally, and you get some further value from the diversification. You can reduce the amounts that you have to put to this while still maintaining the high quality of credit that the rating agencies expect.
So, Elaine, I remember, my memory may be getting a bit faulty, I'm an old man, but I think I remember being at a OAS event in 2022, Pan American event, and the US announces, even before some of the results of the CAF review, that they were going to put a slug of new capital in IDB Invest, that they're going to significantly increase maybe a third of the capital of IDB Invest. And it was part of their sort of belief that the private sector was going to be key to mobilizing development. So, based on some of that experience and you're thinking about what to do with that, is it possible to maybe triple the development banks? And what is the balance between how much new capital you might need and what you can do in terms of sweating and stretching that balance sheet? And I know the IDB's been doing a lot of thinking about that, including thinking about using SDRs maybe to help in stretching that balance sheet.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this interesting panel, because I think it's right on what we're trying to do as IDB Group. Just for the ones that don't know, IDB Invest is a private sector arm of the IDB Group. And as probably you've heard or read in the news, President Golfan announced that IDB Group will be tripling in the next decade our financing for climate action. And it touches on the three things that you've been talking about. It's basically capital increase. There is a capital increase and the commitment of the shareholders to IDB Invest, but also there is a commitment by shareholders of using guarantees in different ways. So there is a balance sheet optimization that is going to happen, while at the same time we will be doing more projects, more green projects as well. So all of that, it came down that in the last decade we did $50 billion for climate action as IDB Group, and we expect that in the next decade we will be able to reach $150 billion. That's our goal. Now, how do we bring this down to everyday projects and things that we're doing? Well, part of the conversations we've had, I think, especially yesterday with Finance Day, there was a lot of conversations about creating new projects, and because maybe we're lacking financeable, bankable projects. And so there is going to be a team, an upstream work team that will try to develop and work on project development. But at the same time, we're doing a synthetic securitization of our own portfolio in IDB Invest. We have hired a legal team and also a financial advisor to identify the portfolio, and we are hoping that in the next few months we'll take it to the rating agencies and see how that will improve our rating or not, how it will affect. Because overall, what you were talking about it's very interesting, and then we have to figure out how does it apply to our region with our portfolio, and so that's part of the process that we're doing. But in addition to that, we recognize that we will have to grow as an institution. At least IDB Invest, we will have to grow. Right now, we're maybe 400 people, 500 people. We will have to hire more people, more specialists, more climate specialists, of course. But also, we will because we will have to grow from 100 deals, closing 100 deals per year to 300 deals per year. Just to give an order of magnitude, what does it mean? So I think there is this.
And do you have the absorptive capacity for that?
Well, that's what we are trying to think and figure out what are the steps. Because even if we go with a capital increase, and let's knock on wood, next March, our shareholders approve the capital increase, then the capital doesn't come in immediately. But we do have to prepare the institution for that, right? And so we have a design and implementation plan, what we call a pivot plan, to do exactly the hiring, the systems, because there is a backbone to this about systems and trying to see how we are going to manage local currency. One of the big things that we know, it's an issue, it's a risk. How are we going to do this project preparation? So we are in the process of getting and approving and preparing ourselves. And within our proposal to the capital increase, IDB Invest alone, capital increase, there's basically this target of our 60% our financing will be geared towards climate.
Can I ask you a question about portfolios? Because portfolio diversification is a key, powerful tool in all of the work we're discussing here. So as the audience knows, the likelihood of one loan failing is much higher than the likelihood of 10 loans failing at the same time. And so we could put in much less capital, etc. But that requires those 10 loans to be different. If you take the same loan divided by 10, there's no portfolio diversification there. And we're talking about a regional development bank. And we're talking about, say, climate mitigation, which itself is these days quite narrow. We think of a wide range of things, but what's working is a limited set of things. Is there enough diversification there, do you think? And is there a scope, if you were not sure, of maybe working with other development banks? I mean, could you say that you and the African Development Bank would share some of your portfolio, so you put out something that is 60% IDB and 40% African Development Bank, and so you get a lot more diversification?
Yes, and I think, so two things. You're totally right, the diversification of portfolio is critical. But I do want to raise the issue, what James has seen and has repeated in the last few days, of the perceived versus the real risk, right? So yes, theoretically, if we have a diversified portfolio, we reduce the risk, but also, we have seen, at least in our portfolio, that the non-performing that you're mentioning is not as such. So it's good news, right? It's good news on that side. Now, to the second point, I think we're trying to diversify. When we started at IDB Invest in 2016, most of our climate and most of our lending in general was infrastructure and mainly energy. We have increased to other sectors, to the real economy, incorporate digital economy, agribusiness. So there are technologies. But as we have heard during these past days, innovation in technology, we don't know yet what will it take or how it will look like. And one important point to the innovation and new technologies and adoption of new technologies is the role of blended finance. We have a specific team that does raise resources of concessional resources. We have Canada, we have UK that have given us resources to be able to enter as the first mover. There is a problem with being the first mover of adopting a technology. It's riskier, we don't know, there's lack of data. Sometimes it is a performing loan, but there are so many unknowns around the new technology that generally other institutional investors or other investors, even the rating agencies, may not know how to value it. So blended finance there, it plays a critical role. And to the last point of working with other MDBs, yes, we are in conversation with the African Development Bank, with the Asian Development Bank. That's more from the finance team that is trying to see how at portfolio level they can manage that kind of swaps between MDBs.
Great. So I want to move to another topic and throw that first question on that topic to Hans-Peter, which is that, okay, so imagine you've tripled your lending capacity in a multilateral development bank. What do you do with that? So if I think of the Bridgetown Initiative, one of the things we've been saying is we need $2.4 trillion for developing countries, and $2.4 trillion is a lot of money. Even if you tripled the multilateral development banks, remember this is per year, even if you tripled the multilateral development banks, you're not getting anywhere close to 2.4 trillion, and that's debt. The countries don't have the capacity to pay back that size. So we need to split this up between, in Bridgetown, we split it up between stuff that generates revenues, stuff that generates savings, stuff that has no revenues, no savings, is a pure cost. And we say that no revenues, no savings, you shouldn't be borrowing for that because you're just going to increase your debt, and you need to get loss and damage fund, you need to get new sources of revenue, and a lot of that looks like loss and damage. And the revenues, that looks a lot like mitigation. solar, wind, hydro. And the savings bit is a lot of resilient stuff, which the private sector doesn't tend to get involved in because there aren't great revenue streams. That seems to be classic territory for multilateral development banks. But equally, on that private sector bit with revenues, they're not coming to developing countries. International private flows are not coming to developing countries because whether it's perceived risks, actual risks, and the MDBs have a role to play in maybe reducing those perceived risks or making people feel those risks aren't there, making them more comfortable with investing. So if you had triple lending capacity, what are you doing with that in terms of your split between revenue stuff, private sector, and more traditional building of resilience?
Do I start?
There's a lot in there to unpack, and I'm going to add something, just if you bear with me for 2 minutes, because the audience, if they've done their numbers, what I said before wasn't adding up to a tripling, right? So how do we get to tripling? Just very quickly. So I got to 80%. You can stretch this, and in the report that was issued yesterday here by the IH leg, they are stretching this in various ways. One is you can use MIGA much more significantly than is the case right now. MIGA is a very efficient channel for diversifying assets and selling them into the insurance market. Okay, they do this today, but up to 60 cents to the dollar. They could go probably further. There are a tiny player right now. There could be a much bigger player in helping the MDBs offload risk into the insurance market. You could strengthen callable capital. There's $1.3 trillion worth of callable capital in the 10 MDBs that we looked at. That's a lot of money. It's not real money because it's not capital. It's actually a form of guarantee, and it's a very loose form of guarantee. You can strengthen that form of guarantee. There are some institutions like the European Stability Mechanisms that have more organized calls, if you want. If you do that, and there is some willingness to do this, just clarifying the procedures, you can strengthen the value of this callable capital. And you can then draw on that to slightly increase the risks that you take on your balance sheet because it's backed by all that callable capital. Happy to go into the details, but you stretch these things, you can get to another 20%, you get 100%. You double your capacity. If you do all that, and then you go to shareholders for additional capital, but you should know that you will get that. You need a package because you need the credibility to do this. If you then go to shareholders, then each additional dollar of capital is going to have a higher leverage ratio. So if on a 10-year cumulative basis, instead of 10 to 1, as the World Bank, for instance, estimates today, you could get to about 15 to 1. And so about $6-7 billion in additional shareholder capital annually over 10 years into the system of MDBs would get you another 100 billion in lending capacity annually. And that is where you get the tripling. And these numbers that I'm quoting here are not unrealistically ambitious. We have studies we commissioned as the CAF panel, studies from specialist outfits that calculate more space, more scope, more headroom. For instance, risk control is probably the best, the most technical outfit in this area. It says you could probably get 75% just out of the capital efficiency measures. And now I'm going to...
But before you do, I want to repeat something of what you just said, because that's so important. So the pathway to tripling is half of that comes from stretching the balance sheet. Yeah. Half of that comes from changing a leverage ratio, employing portfolio guarantees, doing a range of other things that perhaps increases your risk appetite. Half. And the other half, phased maybe over 10 years, now with the extra leverage of stretching a balance sheet, can be achieved with about $6 to $7 billion per year for 10 years. $6 to $7 billion per year. So A country like the UK, that's $240 million per year. A country like America, that's what? Just shy of $1 billion per year.
So like Nick Stern says, it's the cost of a cup of coffee a day, that is going to get you 300 billion worth of lending capacity through the MDB system. And it's worth looking at these numbers because MDBs are a really good proposition for getting value out of your money in terms of just simply the leverage ratios that you get. So
I'm not going to make a political value judgment, but we're saying for $1 billion per year for 10 years from the United States of America, we get a tripling of MDB lending compared to $116 billion spent on the Ukraine war so far.
Well, and it is investment. It's not spent. It's investment in these, it builds balance sheets. It builds, hardware in countries. In principle, it's a value that the taxpayer in these countries keep. Yeah? It's not gone.
So now we permit you to get to the other part of the question. What to do now you've tripled?
Well, so this is a real issue. Because if you work in the MDBs, if you work in the DFIs, and you're asked, so what's your constraint? Do you have not enough money, or what? And the answer is going to be, no, I have enough money. I don't have enough projects. Yeah? And so it's really nice to think about how we scale up and all this financial engineering. If there are no projects, what we're going to see happening is that all these MDBs are going to start fighting over the few, bankable projects there are, and this is happening today, right? So we see subsidy competitions where they all draw on their blending, pots to lend to Uzbekistan renewables, for instance, or Tunisia renewables, where I've really seen this. Different MDBs come in, and then they would offer lower, better conditions, and it's unnecessary because these renewables in these countries do not require blending. So you see that happening. In Africa, if in Malawi there's a power plant, everybody's going to go to that power plant. No, we need to widen the range of projects. If we want to have those investments that are going to deliver the climate mitigation, the climate adaptation, the resilience that we're looking for, we need to create these investments. And the MDBs are not bad at doing that. MDBs are not just a source of money, they're also a source of project preparation, of policy, of advisory, so they can help to create these conditions. They have to take it more seriously. Today, it's a disparate affair. MDBs do not work together on these conditions. In cases where they do, like in the Egyptian power sector, for instance, over 10, 15 years, the results have been tremendous. In the Turkish hospital sector, the results have been great. In Colombia, road sector, the results have been great. So where they work together, some of them focusing on the policy framework, which then enables, say, PPPs, or which brings pension funds, local pension funds together to put their money into these. And then DFIs like IDB Invest come in and finance the private investments into these opportunities. I think there the results are really strong. But this coming together is an exception today. And it's an exception even inside the institution. So IDB is actually a pretty good player there. But if you ask whether IDB and IDB Invest are working together in a seamless manner on a strategy of raising private capital, you will find it depends on the individuals. Yeah.
And before I turn to Ilan, I think I just want to say a few words about this issue, because it's a common issue that we in countries, if I put my Barbados hat on, hear a lot, which is money isn't the issue, projects, viable projects, bankable projects are the issue. I know this irritated Nigel's colleague, climate champion Mahmoud Mohideen, who then went away and found a long list of, spent some time with Catherine and others, developing a list of bankable projects. I think, but I would say from a country perspective, it's a chicken and egg problem. But preparing a project requires money. It's actually the highest risk money there is in the entire chain. And why would you do that if there's no finance there? So you're not going to, as a country, I'm also not going to invest in a new policy regime if there's no money coming. Because in a developing country, our capacity is very limited. I could be sending my good team of people developing the right policy regime for crypto, for infrastructure, for solar. Well, I've got to pick things. I'm going to pick the things where there's money. And so I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. But let's say there's the money. How do we demonstrate the money's there so that people with projects think, well, it is worth putting some money in? Because if I develop this project, IDB Invest may want to invest in it. But, you don't know what you don't know. So if we've tripled, how do we demonstrate where people are there ready to finance bankable things?
I think I would take this in two ways. First, yes, we can say that there's money there, that we can accompany project developers or countries in designing policies. But at the same time, I think we should not be afraid of failure, of testing and going into a project and trying to develop a project. And maybe the result of the feasibility studies is that there's no project. And that's why I agree with you that a very important type of financing here or funding here is grant resources to do exactly that. And maybe we develop projects that do not get to the end line now, but it will end up having an asset, a future investable asset in 3 years' time.
Do you have a project preparation facility?
We do.
You describe that a little bit to us?
So and with IDB actually, with the public sector side, we have a PPP unit that does all the project preparation for large infrastructure projects for PPPs. But we also, within IDB Invest, we have grant resources to work with corporates to prepare the projects. But I do want to mention that specifically when I was thinking about coming to the panel about adaptation, the type of thinking around adaptation and project preparation is a bit different. And I will get that. But let me just explain how we have resources. So we have resources, grant resources. We have projects and sponsors that come and ask us to put some of the resources. And we just have a reimbursable clause there. That if they end up just deciding to finance with somebody else and they exclude us, because of course we want to be part of the project, they can reimburse us from the future financing that they get, but at least we put it the initial money. If they finance it with us, we don't ask for the reimbursement. I mean, if the project is not viable, they can go home and that's fine. That's feasible. But now, in terms of adaptation, there's a time lag that we have to identify here. So with projects, when we engage with project preparation for mitigation, I think it's clear, as you said, there's a revenue, they understand, or there's a saving, energy saving. With adaptation, the results of the studies sometimes take longer. And it's much more expensive, and it may take, instead of 3 months, it will take a year, because we have to get the data, and it takes time to see the data. And so the corporates that have engaged with us and said, oh,
Could I just say to that point you make, my Prime Minister famously says that when we're designing our sea walls, we have to wait for a full year of the tide data. And if we start that project at the wrong time of the year, it can take more than a full year as we wait to get all of that data. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly right. And that's why we are trying to see if we can engage with the client and say, let us get the data, let us give you the analysis, and maybe we can use instruments that we already have, like unfunded, uncommitted credit lines for you, to then invest in that with a specific incentive that you are going to invest in adaptation. But there is a difference in that I just wanted to point out in talk of project preparation.
We were lucky to have Yannick in the audience from the formerly from the GCF, and I know, and a great financial innovator. I know you've thought a lot about project preparation issues and built some of that in to the capital that the GCF gave. I mean, is that the case? Is it a big issue? Do you think you have a solution to it? You can't sit comfortably in this room.
Actually, you made the point brilliantly. The riskiest part for a project developer is the project formulation phase. And this cost money. It can cost 5% of the total cost of the project quite easily, especially in adaptation, if you want to make sure that your project is resilient to a huge range of climate feature. When you were saying we need 1 year of data for my seawall, would be better if you had 1,000 years of data, actually. Because that's the way you do. You try to design it for a 100-year event or a 1,000-year event. Unfortunately, all the statistics of the past have no value today.
You guys are so slow.
But you know, you can go fast if you want, and you will go fast. You will smash very fast to the wall. Because design badly your infrastructure, and you will regret it. You will regret it in terms of cost, because rather than being maybe 5 or 10% more expensive than a conventional infrastructure, it might end up being 20%, and it might not work. So you have always this trade-off between speed and robustness. But project development is by far the riskiest part for project developers, because you are saying the government, why should I invest in that policy? By and large, infrastructure, you have better to invest. The few resources you have them, invest them in infrastructure. 80% of your mitigation costs are infrastructure, 90% of your adaptation costs are infrastructure. But for a project developer, why should I do it? So for example, the Green Climate Fund, what we did in a number of occasions was to come with a structured product where you had a PDF, a project development facility, grant base. If the projects were to be commissioned, this grant will be converted into an equity, basically a project equity, and normally GCF will provide some additional project equity. And the idea was that once all the projects are up and running, renewable project up and running are plain vanilla project. You have to be talented to kill commission renewable energy project after to try to offload them to the market in the form of a green ABS. So you can do this kind of thing, but one has to do it.
Thank you very much, Yannick. That's great. I want to open this up to others in the audience too. But before, I just want to make one point and see what others think about that, which is that we've been focused a lot about private sector. And the private sector is important to mobilize, especially around the huge mitigation task we have. It's a challenge in developing countries because our private sector is often shallow. In fact, it's a weird situation. I was born in Barbados, but grew up in the UK, where we think of the risk taker as the private sector, and the government as being very slow and very stolid and risk averse. But in developing countries, the public sector is often the risk taker, because the private sector's got a nice, easy, cushion job in selling stuff to the public sector, and they get a nice return from that. The notion of taking a risk they don't do that. The public sector does the risk, and they don't really have the structures able to do that very well. So it's a challenge. But the other thing I want to say is that we've this whole debate about we must raise capital for the development banks, they must lend more, and then people say it's about the private sector, but we also need some old traditional development bank lending, especially for infrastructure, where these are very expensive things. And they cost hundreds of millions of dollars, often don't generate an easy revenue, and we need some of that capital for that as well. Is that fair?
No, absolutely. And I think it's kind of useful to look at the investments that are needed and split them up into what is going to be, as you said earlier, revenue generating and what is not. And for what is not, and that's quite a bit of adaptation finance is not directly revenue generating. Quite a bit of it may be expected to improve future fiscal revenues in the country because it won't be lost, if you will. But there's even quite a bit of it that is not going to do that either. So if the coastal protection is not going to improve future tax revenues either. So there's no way around bringing public money in. And I think we need to be quite clear. There's a lot in this conference here at the COP. Just yesterday, I've been on 4 panels that were talking about private mobilization, and there's a big buzz around it, and it's great, and it's good. We have been utterly unsuccessful at it. Private finance has fallen over the past 10 years, with billions
actually,
to trillions
repeat that. I
It's
saw this
fallen,
amazing number the other day. FDI to developing countries peaked in 2004, 2005, and is now almost below 2000 levels. That's FDI.
Yeah.
So if
I think you have to if you take China out, the numbers become a bit more interpretable, but you get basically a reduction since just after the global financial crisis. 2012 was sort of the high mark, and then it's come down by about 20% net flows into developing countries. So what have we done, right? All these efforts, and there are wonderful success stories. You go, when I worked for the IFC, I can give you a list of fantastic projects where we mobilized all this money, Mozambique, trillions and whatever. And it looks very good. And IDB Invest is actually, I think, one of the most innovative in this area. So you have these successors, but they don't add up to an aggregate picture. So I'm just saying this. It's great to work with the private sector. There's more that we need to do. I think there has to be a more holistic approach, sector-based approaches rather than transaction-based approaches and the like. But we need the public sector, and we cannot forget that. We have to keep the pressure on governments to increase them, and that's a very sad picture. Okay, ODA is declining. Some of the most generous donors of the past are cutting. The Nordics, Germany, UK are cutting down in their ODA. There is very little prospect right now for them to increase that. But we know that we will need that money. That's quality money to do the kind of resilience and adaptation work, to do the kind of project preparation work, to do those things that we know are needed. Yeah? So I think we have to keep the spotlight. It's great now, we've kind of solved the MDB story. There has to be far more sustained push, clearly. We have ideas for the private sector, but it's a bit speculative. But we have to keep the pressure on the public. And one thing that I don't understand is why we make so little progress on new sources of international taxation. And I know you, Avinash, have been great in that. You got the Paris summit, Macron and everybody else, here we go. And we're going to look at IMO, international maritime taxes and carbon taxes and then it all fizzles out. But does anyone see another source, a credible source of increase? The World Bank estimates that the international maritime carbon tax could get us 50, 60 billion a year. That would be very valuable if that could be put into the schemes that we're talking about. If the CBAM, the EU CBAM, were to give a slice of their future revenue to these schemes, that would be tens of billions as well. Those would be valuable sources. If the Californian energy trading system, I know we're not going to count on the US Congress to give it, but if the Californian energy trading system were to give a slice of its revenues to these kind of schemes, we would get a lot of mileage. Why isn't this moving forward? Why do we see so little sustained effort on the part of key governments to try to get this done?
That's a great point. It's, I think, an objective of the new International Taxation Task Force established by Macron and Ruto, of which Barbados is participating in. We really need to develop these things. There's a fair bit of design required, good design, to make sure, because with every tax, I mean, every tax, of course, has an equal and opposite opposition to it, and you need to design it well to minimize that. So, for example, the emissions tax, the shipping emissions tax, run aground, to excuse my metaphor, on the fact that Latin America, in particular, was more disproportionately impacted. But good design can deal with that. Good design can deal with that. Are there any thoughts or questions from the audience, please?
Thank you. Fascinating. I'm on the board of a small accelerator in Nigeria, project development facility, that seeks to connect projects to investors. Most of the projects we deal with are smaller than what MDBs would invest in, so I'd like to ask you about aggregation, portfolio approaches. What can MDBs do to create the vehicles for those small projects to access finance?
Ellen, do you want to kick off on that?
Yeah, I think that I was just thinking that there are different vehicles that we may have for aggregation, and we've tested. Some of them have worked better than others, but I think we have to continue testing. But one of the things that I see is that many times with the small projects, we have to partner with a financial institution, a local financial institution, to help us do that. Even development banks, and here's Anderson, the division chief of the financial institutions at IDB, that he has worked a lot with a development bank to be able to work with smaller projects.
So in fact, you have some facilities where you, either at a bank or, in fact, I think in Barbados we have a tourism facility which the central bank administers. So you arrange a facility and then someone local can then go to projects that would just be too small
for us.
Yeah. Hans-Peter?
Yeah, for the MDBs, the issue there is cost. You have some, like, IFC, I don't know if IDB Invest, that have actually decided to segregate a slice of their balance sheets for higher risk transactions. But so IFC, for instance, for 10 years or so, was doing direct investments into small projects, small being, even under $1 million, which is small in those terms, in Africa. They closed that after a review some 10 years ago because it was too costly. But others have done a better job at managing the costs in these. Venture capital investments typically are managed in a way that they become financially viable on a portfolio basis. So there are ways of doing this. I think that the DFIs, the core is what we've heard is about enabling local financial institutions to do this, because it is really hard to finance smaller projects from Washington or wherever else.
Mm-hmm.
Please, a question in the back there, Karima.
Hi, Keisha Farnham, Director of Public Sector Projects from the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. I came into the room when you were talking about duplication of efforts and multilateral development banks, but I also think donor agencies understanding the lay of the land and what's actually happening in the space so that they are actually filling gaps rather than duplicating efforts. Alongside the IDB, we would have created the Energy Partners Working Group. And in that group, we have all the multilateral development banks in the region represented, but we also have the donor agencies. And incredibly, what has happened in a very short space of time, because the group started last year, August, we started the group. USAID realized that they had pumped a lot of money into basically aggregating the projects across the region. And these are the energy projects that we're doing. What are the needs? What are the gaps? CCRE, funded by the Caribbean Development Bank, was also doing the same thing. And they had a technology platform in which they were capturing the data. And because of that group, and because of us just talking to each other, because literally that's what we're doing. We're talking to each other in these meetings that we have periodically. We were able to collate resources, bring that together, and now USAID is basically supporting CCRE in terms of making sure that the data is on there as well.
But can I press you on that? But
Yeah.
you mentioned duplication.
Yeah.
But was there competition? Was there any
There
Any
was
difficulty in
no
the collaboration?
which was quite amazing. Like once we had the conversation with USA, they were like, "Oh, this is already happening here. We want to support the region." CCRI is a mechanism that actually is built to support the region. It's a CARICOM agency. We want to support you guys, and so it did take a little bit of reorganizing, right? But that reorganizing actually happened within the space of 3 months. And they came back to us and said, yes, we're going to go ahead and join this. So I think, having those conversations, because that then informs larger project design, right? So being able to have those conversations, have the multilaterals also talking to the development agencies, particularly when you're dealing with a region. It's a good few of us, right? And we all serve different partners. So there's some intersectionality in terms of the countries that we serve. But if we're able to have those conversations, then we're able to build better projects that are inherently more successful because we have all the information we need to make them thrive. Yeah.
Alon, would you like to? Has this been are you familiar with this experience?
I think that's a great experience. My experience is that, yes, we're trying to collaborate between MDBs, but I think sometimes headlines basically shy us away from collaborating in a practical way, if I may say so. So I think when there is a will, there is a way, and if we want to collaborate better, we find ways to collaborate, but I think it's all down to people, if I say. I mean, if we know each other and we can find solutions, we can do it in 3 months. I was surprised when you said 3 months, because I've seen things that take a little bit longer when we try to, we have the same ideas, but then we end up, one of us trying to lead on that engagement. So I just want to be clear. But in Barbados, and probably because we have the government pushing us to collaborate, we're doing now the debt swap for climate with EIB, with the GCF, with, us, IDB Invest, and public sector IDB, which is good to bring us all into the table. But sometimes, even in those conversations, even when we talk about project preparations for me, when I hear the public sector, they may refer to something else in their minds. While we think of bankable projects, project preparation for them can be a design of a technical cooperation, which are two different things, right? And so even the language can be a little bit different, but that's a great experience.
Lovely. Hans-Peter? And also if you could add any final remarks.
Okay. So I think it's a really important point that you're raising. Coordination among the MDBs is the exception, not the rule. In the climate area, we've probably the most successful examples of coordination. There's the Climate Working Group, which has been operating 15 years. That's reasonably good, but that isn't, then you have all the other agencies and you people stepping on it. We did a survey, ODI, among recipient countries, which we're going to repeat next year. And this is sort of the number one concern that they have. You have governments with limited capacity that get, hundreds, literally, of donors and agencies that deal with them, different requirements, duplicating things, and they have a hard time dealing with that. So there needs to, point number one. Point number two, we have a climate crisis. There is urgency. Very often in these discussions, urgency isn't reflected. What does urgency mean? We have to solve things differently from just letting initiatives go here and there and having that inefficiency that comes. We have to organize, and that means coordinate. It has to be coordinated at the country level. The Stern-Songwe report yesterday makes a very big push for country climate platforms. I think that's really the way to think about it. We have had efforts around country platforms in the past. There's a bit of cynicism around that. I think if they're focused on particular tasks on a sector basis, there's more scope to be successful, like Egypt or Vietnam or countries where you can see it can work if it's done in the right way. So a focus. It has to be at the country level. If you just have it at the MDB level, it's too abstract. It has to come down to what the country actually needs. So that's the point I want to make. And on my final remarks, I want to point to that urgency element. I think in all of this discussion that we're having, how to set ourselves up for resilience, for adaptation, for mitigation, finance, we have to bring that sense of urgency into the discussion. And it is where the political side needs to keep its feet to the fire, and civil society, everybody else, has to push the political side. We cannot forget the sense of urgency.
Fantastic. And as you were speaking earlier, you reminded me of something which I hadn't ever thought would be a problem. One of the most impactful things in my life was being asked to help Dominica in their economic recovery after Maria. They'd been flattened by this hurricane, lost 226% of GDP in 4 hours, and I'm on this UN plane flying into Dominica, racking my brains as to what is the solution, and you arrive there and you find solutions are not your problem. There are thousands of people coming to you with their own thousands of solutions. In fact, your problem is trying to work out who should you listen to and who should you... And the problem is if you didn't listen to people, they then start to complain. And they start to go in the press and they say, Dominica doesn't want our help. And it's like, and of course you look really bad when that's happening. So we were struggling, drowning under the weight of people wanting to help, much of it completely useless and distracting. But how do you process all of that was a big issue. Ellen, your final remarks.
So I just want to say that we started talking about MDB reform or tripling our financing, and at least in that point, we've advanced a lot as MDBs in the issue of how to triple, and there are different solutions. I think now it's, okay, if we have the resources, how are we going to deploy it? And the country platforms, it's a very important solution, but how do we actually collaborate and have fruitful partnerships? I think there are examples that can be replicated, either by two MDBs, but we should do it as a system. I think it's more powerful as a system. But I think that I do want to raise the point of the public commitment, continuous public commitment. This is not only about private sector, this is not only about public sector. It's not all about MDBs, it's not all about countries. I think we have to collaborate more as a system. And the fact that we are still in COP28 and we're still adding COPs and COPs and we haven't quite solved it, I think that the point of urgency comes back to mind.
Yeah, just the addendum to that, just to make clear what urgency really means. We had an announcement a couple of days ago by the World Bank that they were going to go to 45% climate finance. That's great, but it's 45% of what? If we want to triple, if that is what we have all concluded needs to happen, we have to triple, we have to go in big steps next year, the year after. Yeah? Yep. And those, what is that picture? How much is going to be available next year? How much is going to be available the year after? We haven't gotten there yet in this discussion, despite all the goodwill, in fact, that you see. There's no pinning down.
I think a victory of 2023 was that we now have a blueprint. We have an emerging climate finance system. And that we know that the heart of that system is the multilateral development banks. They need to be 3 times bigger. A focus maybe on adaptation, but also catalytic in the private sector. And we have a pathway of how to triple. That we can get halfway there by stretching and sweating the balance sheet, and halfway there by phased new capital. But now that we have this blueprint, this emerging climate finance system, we've got to implement and deliver quickly. Please thank my panelists for a wonderful session.
Thank you.